Chapter 5. Perplexity Among Honest People. Thomasin looked as if quite overcome by her aunt's change of manner. "It means just what it seems to mean. I am not married," she replied faintly. "Excuse me for humiliating you, aunt, by this mishap. I am sorry for it, but I cannot help it." "Me? Think of yourself first." "It was nobody's fault. When we got there, the parson wouldn't marry us because of some trifling irregularity with the license." "What irregularity?" "I don't know. Mr. Wildeave can explain. I did not think when I went away this morning that I should come back like this." It being dark, Thomasin allowed her emotion to escape her by the silent way of tears, which could roll down her cheek unseen. "I could say almost that it serves you right, if I did not feel that you don't deserve it," continued Mrs. Yeobright, who, possessing two distinct moods in close contiguity, a gentle mood and an angry, flew from one to the other without the least warning. "Remember, Thomasin, this business was none of my seeking. From the very first, when you began to feel foolish about that man, I warned you he would not make you happy. I felt it so strongly that I did what I would never have believed myself capable of doing, stood up in the church and made myself the public talk for weeks. But having once consented, I don't submit to these fancies without good reason. Marry him you must, after this." "Do you think I wish to do otherwise for one moment?" said Thomasin with a heavy sigh. "I know how wrong it was of me to love him, but don't pain me by talking like that, aunt. You would not have had me stay there with him, would you? And your house is the only home I have to return to. He says we can be married in a day or two." "I wish he had never seen you." "Very well, then I will be the miserablest woman in the world, and not let him see me again. No, I won't have him." "It's too late to speak so. Come with me. I am going to the inn to see if he has returned. Of course, I shall get to the bottom of this story at once. Mr. Wildeave must not suppose he can play tricks upon me or any belonging to me." "It was not like that. The license was wrong, and he couldn't get another the same day. He will tell you in a moment now how it was, if he comes." "Why didn't he bring you back?" "That was me," again sobbed Thomasin. "When I found we could not be married, I didn't like to come back with him, and I was very ill, and then I saw Diggory Ben, and he was glad to get him and take me home. I cannot explain it any better, and you must be angry with me if you will." "I shall see about that," said Mrs. Yeobright, and they turned towards the inn, well known in the neighbourhood as the Quiet Woman. The sign of her, which represented the figure of a matron carrying her head under her arm, beneath which gruesome design was written the couplet so well known to frequenters of the inn: "Since the woman's quiet, let no man breed a riot." Footnote. The inn which really bore this sign and legend stood some miles to the northwest of the present scene, wherein the house more immediately referred to is now no longer an inn, and the surroundings are much changed. But another inn, some of whose features are also embodied in this description, the Red Lion at Winfrith, still remains as a haven for the wayfarer. 1912. The front of the house was towards the heath and rain-barrow, whose dark shape seemed to threaten it from the sky. Upon the door was a neglected brass plate, bearing the unexpected inscription, "Mr. Wildeave, Engineer," a useless yet cherished relic from the time when he had been started in that profession in an office at Budmouth by those who had hoped much from him and had been disappointed. The garden was at the back, and behind this ran a still, deep stream, forming the margin of the heath in that direction, meadowland appearing beyond the stream. but the thick obscurity permitted only skylines to be visible of any scene at present. The water at the back of the house could be heard, idly spinning whirlpools in its creep between the rows of dry feather-headed reeds which formed a stockade along each bank. Their presence was denoted by sounds as of a congregation praying humbly, produced by their rubbing against each other in the slow wind. The window whence the candlelight had shone up the vale to the eyes of the bonfire group was uncurtained, but the sill lay too high for a pedestrian on the outside to look over it into the room. A vast shadow, in which could be dimly traced portions of a masculine contour, blotted half the ceiling. "He seems to be at home," said Mrs. Yeobright.
"Must I come in too, aunt?" asked Thomasin faintly. "I suppose not. It would be wrong."
"You must come, certainly, to confront him, so that he may make no false representations to me. We shall not be 5 minutes in the house, and then we'll walk home." Entering the open passage, she tapped at the door of the private parlour, unfastened it, and looked in. The back and shoulders of a man came between Mrs. Yeobright's eyes and the fire. Willdeve, whose form it was, immediately turned, arose, and advanced to meet his visitors. He was quite a young man, and of the two properties, form and motion, the latter first attracted the eye to him. The grace of his movement was singular. It was the pantomimic expression of a lady-killing career. Next came to notice the more material qualities, among which was a profuse crop of hair impending over the top of his face, lending to his forehead the high-cornered outline of an early Gothic shield, and a neck which was smooth and round as a cylinder. The lower half of his figure was of light build. Altogether, he was one in whom no man would have seen anything to admire, and in whom no woman would have seen anything to dislike. He discerned the young girl's form in the passage, and said, "Thomasin, then, has reached home. How could you leave me that way, darling?" And, turning to Mrs. Yeobright, it was useless to argue with her. She would go, and go alone. "But what's the meaning of it all?" demanded Mrs. Yeobright haughtily. "Take a seat," said Willdeve, placing chairs for the two women. "Well, it was a very stupid mistake, but such mistakes will happen. The licence was useless at Anglebury. It was made out for Budmouth, but as I didn't read it, I wasn't aware of that." "But you had been staying at Anglebury." "No, I had been at Budmouth until 2 days ago, and that was where I had intended to take her. But when I came to fetch her, we decided upon Anglebury, forgetting that a new licence would be necessary. There was not time to get to Budmouth afterwards." "I think you are very much to blame," said Mrs. Yeobright. "It was quite my fault we chose Anglebury," Thomasin pleaded. "I proposed it because I was not known there." "I know so well that I am to blame that you need not remind me of it," replied Willdeve shortly. "Such things don't happen for nothing," said the aunt. "It is a great slight to me and my family, and when it gets known there will be a very unpleasant time for me. How can she look her friends in the face tomorrow? It is a very great injury, and one I cannot easily forgive. It may even reflect on her character." "Nonsense," said Willdeve. Thomasin's large eyes had flown from the face of one to the face of the other during this discussion, and she now said anxiously, "Will you allow me, aunt, to talk it over alone with Damon for 5 minutes? Will you, Damon?" "Certainly, dear," said Willdeve, "if your aunt will excuse us." He led her into an adjoining room, leaving Mrs. Yeobright by the fire. As soon as they were alone and the door closed, Thomasin said, turning up her pale, tearful face to him, "It is killing me, this, Damon. I did not mean to part from you in anger at Anglebury this morning, but I was so frightened, and I hardly knew what I said. I have not let aunt know how much I suffered to-day.
It is so hard to command my face and voice, and to smile as if it were a slight thing to me. But I try to do so, that she might not be still more indignant with you. I know you could not help it, dear, whatever my aunt might think."
"She is very unpleasant."
"Yes," Thomasin murmured, "and I suppose I seem so now. Damon, what do you mean to do about me?"
"Do about you?"
"Yes. Those who don't like you whisper such things which at moments make me doubt you. We mean to marry, I suppose, don't we?"
"Of course we do. We have only to go to Budmouth on Monday, and we marry at once."
"Then do let us go. Oh, Damon, what you make me say!"
She hid her face in her handkerchief.
"Here I am asking you to marry me, when by rights you ought to be on your knees imploring me, your cruel mistress, not to refuse you, and saying it would break your heart if I did. I used to think it would be pretty and sweet like that, but how different!"
"Yes, real life is never at all like that."
"But I don't care, personally, if it never takes place," she added with a little dignity. "No, I can live without you. It is aunt I think of. She is so proud, and thinks so much of her family respectability, that she will be cut down with mortification if this story should get abroad before it is done. My cousin Clem, too, will be much wounded."
"Then he will be very unreasonable. In fact, you're all rather unreasonable." Thomasin coloured a little, and not with love. But whatever the momentary feeling which caused that flush in her, it went as it came, and she humbly said,
"I never mean to be, if I can help it. I merely feel that you have my aunt to some extent in your power at last."
"As a matter of justice, it is almost due to me," said Willdeve. "Think what I have gone through to win her consent, the insult that it is to any man to have the banns forbidden, the double insult to a man unlucky enough to be cursed with sensitiveness and blue demons and heaven knows what, as I am. I can never forget those banns. A harsher man would rejoice now in the power I have of turning upon your aunt by going no further in the business." She looked wistfully at him with her sorrowful eyes as he said those words, and her aspect showed that more than one person in the room could deplore the possession of sensitiveness. Seeing that she was really suffering, he seemed disturbed, and added, "This is merely reflection, you know. I have not the least intention to refuse to complete the marriage. Tamsie mine, I could not bear it."
"You could not, I know," said the fair girl, brightening. "You who cannot bear the sight of pain in even an insect, or in any disagreeable sound, or unpleasant smell even, will not long cause pain to me and mine."
"I will not, if I can help it."
"Your hand upon it, Damon."
He carelessly gave her his hand. "Ah, by my crown, what's that?" he said suddenly. There fell upon their ears the sound of numerous voices singing in front of the house. Among these, two made themselves prominent by their peculiarity. One was a very strong bass, the other a wheezy, thin piping. Thomasin recognized them as belonging to Timothy Fairway and Grandfrere Cantle, respectively.
"What does it mean? It is not skimmity riding, I hope," she said, with a frightened gaze at Willdeve.
"Of course not. No, it is that the heathfolk have come to sing us a welcome. This is intolerable." He began pacing about, the men outside singing cheerfully. "He told her she was the joy of his life, and if she'd consent he would make her his wife. She could not refuse him to church, so they went. Young Will was forgot, and young Sue was content. And then she was kissed and set down on his knee. No man in the world was so loving as he." Mrs. Yeobright burst in from the outer room. "Thomasin! Thomasin!" she said, looking indignantly at Willdeve. "Here's a pretty exposure! Let us escape at once. Come!" It was, however, too late to get away by the passage. A rugged knocking had begun upon the door of the front room. Willdeve, who had gone to the window, came back. "Stop!" he said imperiously, putting his hand upon Mrs. Yeobright's arm. "We are regularly besieged. There are 50 of them out there if there's one. You stay in this room with Thomas, and I'll go out and face them. You must stay now, for my sake, till they are gone, so that it may seem as if all was right. Come, Tamsy, dear, don't go making a scene. We must marry after this, that you can see as well as I. Sit still, that's all, and don't speak much. I'll manage them, plundering fools." He pressed the agitated girl into a seat, returned to the outer room, and opened the door. Immediately outside, in the passage, appeared Grandfrère Cantal, singing in concert with those still standing in front of the house. He came to the room, nodded abstractedly to Willdeve, his lips still parted, and his features excruciatingly strained in the admission of the chorus. This being ended, he said heartily, "Here's welcome to the new-made couple, and God bless 'em." "Thank you," said Willdeve, with dry resentment, his face as gloomy as a thunderstorm. At the Grandfrère's heels now came the rest of the group, which included Fairway, Christian, Sam the turf-cutter, Humphrey, and a dozen others. All smiled upon Willdeve, and upon his tables and chairs likewise, from a general sense of friendliness towards the articles, as well as towards their owner. "We be not here afore Mrs. Yeobright after all," said Fairway, recognizing the matron's bonnet through the glass partition which divided the public apartment they had entered from the room where the women sat. "We struck down across, you see, Mr. Willdeve, and she went round by the path." "And I see the young bride's little head," said Grandfrère, peeping in the same direction, and discerning Thomasin, who was waiting beside her aunt in a miserable and awkward way. "Not quite settled yet. Well, there's plenty of time." Willdeve made no reply, and probably feeling that the sooner he treated them, the sooner they would go, he produced a stone jar, which threw a warm halo over matters at once. "There's a drop of the right sort, I can see," said Grandfrère Cantal, with the air of a man too well-mannered to show any hurry to taste it. "Yes," said Willdeve, "'tis some old mead. I hope you will like it." "Oh, aye," replied the guests, in the hearty tones natural when the words demanded by politeness coincide with those of deepest feeling. "There isn't a prettier drink under the sun." "I'll take my oath there isn't," added Grandfrère Cantal. "All that can be said against mead is that 'tis rather heady, and apt to lie about a man a good while. But tomorrow's Sunday, thank God. I feel all the world like some bold soldier after I had had some once," said Christian. "You shall feel so again," said Willdeve with condescension. "Cups or glasses, gentlemen?" "Well, if you don't mind, we'll have the beaker and passing around. 'Tis better than kneeling it out in dribbles." "Down the slippery glasses," said Grandfrère Cantal. "What's the good of a thing you can't put down in the ashes to warm, eh, neighbours? That's what I ask." "Right, Grandfrère," said Sam, and the mead then circulated. "Well," said Timothy Fairway, feeling demands upon his praise in some form or other, "'tis a worthy thing to be married, Mr. Willdeve, and the woman you got is a dismont, so says I. Yes," he continued to Grandfrère Cantal, raising his voice so as to be heard through the partition, "her father," inclining his head towards the inner room, "was as good a feller as ever lived. He always had this great indignation ready against anything underhand." "Is that very dangerous?" said Christian. "And there were few in these parts who were upsides with him," said Sam. "Whenever a club walked, he'd play the clarinet in the band that marched before him, as if he'd never touched anything but a clarinet all his life. And then, when they got to church door, he'd throw down the clarinet, mount the gallery, and snatch up the bass viol, and rouse 'em away as if he'd never played anything but a bass viol. Folk would say, folk that knowed what a true stave was, Surely that's never the same man that I saw handling the clarinet so masterly by now." "I can mind it," said the furze cutter. "'Twas a wonderful thing that one body could hold it all, and never mix the fingering." "There was Kingsbere Church likewise," Fairway recommenced, as one opening a new vein at the same mine of interest. Wildeave breathed the breath of one intolerably bored, and glanced through the partition at the prisoners. "He used to walk over there of a Sunday morning to visit his old acquaintance Andrew Brown, the first clarinet there. A good man enough, but rather screechy in his music, if you can mind, a was. And neighbour Yeobright would take Andre's place for some part of the service, to let Andre have a bit of a nap, as any friend would naturally do." "As any friend would," said Grandfriar Cantle, the other listeners expressing the same accord by the shorter way of nodding their heads. "No sooner was Andre asleep than the first whiff of neighbour Yeobright's wind had got up inside Andre's clarinet than every one in the church feeled in a moment that there was a great soul among 'em. All heads 'ud turn, and they'd say, 'Ah, I thought 'twas he.' One Sunday I can well mind, a bass viol day at that time, and Yeobright had brought his own. 'Twas the 133rd to Lydia, and when they'd come to ran down his beard, and o'er his robes its costly moisture shed, neighbour Yeobright, who had just warmed to his work, drove his bow into them strings that glorious grand that he e'en almost sawed the bass viol into two pieces. Every window in the church rattled, as if there were a thunderstorm. Old Parson Williams lifted his hands in his great holy surplice, as natural as if he'd been in common clothes, and seemed to say to himself, 'Oh, for such a man in our parish!' But not a soul in Kingsbere could hold a candle to Yeobright." "Was it quite safe when the window shook?" Christian inquired. He received no answer, all for the moment sitting rapt in admiration of the performances described. As with Farinelli's singing before the princesses, Sheridan's renowned Begum speech, and other such examples, the fortunate condition of its being for ever lost to the world invested the deceased Mr. Yeobright's tour de force on that memorable afternoon with a cumulative glory which comparative criticism, had that been possible, might considerably have shorn down. "He was the last you'd expect to drop off in the prime o' life," said Humphrey. "Ah, well, he was looking for the earth some months afore he went. At that time women used to run for smocks and gown pieces at Greenhill Fair, and my wife that is there now, being a long-legged slittering maid, hardly husband high, went with the rest of the maidens, for 'a was a good runner afore she got so heavy. When she came home, I said, we were then just beginning to walk together, 'What have you got me, honey?' 'I've won a gown piece,' says she, her colours coming up in a moment. 'Tis a smock for a crown, I thought, and so it turned out. Aye, when I think what she'll say to me now, without a muscle of red in her face, it do seem strange that I wouldn't say much a little thing then. However, then she went on, and that's what made me bring up the story. Well, whatever clothes I've worn, white or figured, for eyes to see or for eyes not to see, I could do a pretty stroke of modesty in those days. I'd sooner have lost it than have seen what I have. Poor Mr. Yeobright was took bad directly he reached the fairground, and was forced to go home again, and that was the last time he ever went out to the parish. I faltered on one day to another, and then we heard he was gone." "Do you think he was in great pain when he died?" said Christian. "Oh, no, quite different. Nor any pain of mind. He was lucky enough to be God A'mighty's own man." "And the other folk, do you think 'twill be much pain to 'em, Mr. Fairway?" "That depends on whether they be afeard." "I bain't afeard at all, I thank God," said Christian strenuously.
I'm glad I bain't, for there 'twon't pain me. And I don't think I be afeard, or if I be I can't help it, and then I don't deserve to suffer. I wish I was not afeard at all."
There was a solemn silence, and looking from the window, which was unshuttered and unblinded, Timothy said, "Well, what a fresh little bonfire that one is, out by Captain Vy's. 'Tis burning just the same now as e'er, upon my life." All glances went to the window, and nobody noticed that Wildeave disguised a brief, tell-tale look. Far away up the sombre valley of the heath, and to the right of Rainbarrow, could indeed be seen the light, small but steady, and persistent as before. "It was lighted before ours was," Fairway continued, "and yet every one in the county round is out before'n."
"Perhaps there's meaning in it?" murmured Christian.
"How meaning?" said
Wildeave sharply.
Christian was too scattered to reply, and Timothy helped him. "He means, sir, that the lonesome, dark-eyed creature up there, that some say is a witch, ever I should call a fine young woman such a name, is always up to some odd conceit or other, and so perhaps 'tis she. I'd be very glad to take her in wedlock if she'd me, and take the risk of her wild dark eyes ill-wishing me," said Grandfriar Cantle staunchly.
"Don't ye say it, father," implored Christian.
"Well, be dazed if he who do marry the maid won't have an uncommon picture for his best parlour," said Fairway in a liquid tone, placing down the cup of mead at the end of a good pull. "And a partner as deep as the North Star," said Sam, taking up the cup and finishing the little that remained. "Well, really, now I think we must be moving," said Humphrey, observing the emptiness of the vessel. "But we'll gie him another song," said Grandfriar Cantle. "I'm as full of notes as a bird." "Thank you, Grandfriar," said Wildeave, "but we'll not trouble you now. Some other day must do for that, when I can have a party."
"Be jowned if I don't learn 10 new songs for it, or I won't learn a line," said Grandfriar Cantle. "And may you make sure I won't disappoint ye by biding away, Mr. Wildeave."
"I quite believe you," said that gentleman.
All then took their leave, wishing their entertainer long life and happiness as a married man, with recapitulations which occupied some time. Wildeave attended them to the door, beyond which the deep-eyed upward stretch of heath stood awaiting them, an amplitude of darkness reigning from their feet almost to the zenith. There was a definite form first became visible in the lowering forehead of Rainbarrow, diving into the dense obscurity in a line headed by Sam the turf-cutter. They pursued their trackless way home. When the scratching of the furs against their leggings had fainted upon the ear, Wildeave returned to the room where he had left Thomasin and her aunt. The women were gone. They could only have left the house in one way, by the back window, and this was open. Wildeave laughed to himself, remained a moment thinking, and idly returned to the front room. Here his glance fell upon a bottle of wine which stood on the mantelpiece. "Ah, old Dowden," he murmured, and going to the kitchen door shouted, "Is anybody here who can take something to old Dowden?" There was no reply. The room was empty, the lad who acted as his factotum having gone to bed. Wildeave came back, put on his hat, and took the bottle and left the house, turning the key in the door, for there was no guest at the inn to-night. As soon as he was on the road, the little bonfire on Mistover Nap again met his eye. "Still waiting, are you, milady?" he murmured. However, he did not proceed that way just then, but, leaving the hill to the left of him, he stumbled over a rutted road that brought him to a cottage which, like all other habitations on the heath at this hour, was only saved from being visible by a faint shine from its bedroom window. The house was the home of Ollie Dowden,
the besom-maker, and he entered. The lower room was in darkness, but by feeling his way he found a table, whereupon he placed the bottle, and a minute later emerged again upon the heath. He stood and looked northeast at the undying little fire, high up above him, though not so high as Rainbarrow. We have always been told what happens when a woman deliberates, and the epigram is not always terminable with the woman, provided that one be in the case, and that a fair one. Wildeave stood, and stood longer, and breathed perplexedly, and then said to himself with resignation, "Yes, by heaven, I must go to her, I suppose." Instead of turning in the direction of home, he pressed on rapidly by a path under Rainbarrow towards what was evidently a signal light. So ends Chapter 5, Perplexity Among Honest People. Chapter 6, The Figure Against the Sky. When the whole Egdon concourse had left the site of the bonfire to its accustomed loneliness, a closely wrapped female figure approached the barrow from that quarter of the heath in which the little fire lay. Had the Reddleman been watching, he might have recognized her as the woman who had first stood there so singularly and vanished at the approach of strangers. She ascended to her old position at the top, where the red coals of the perishing fire greeted her like living eyes in the corpse of the day. There she stood still, around her stretching the vast night atmosphere, whose incomplete darkness, in comparison with the total darkness of the heath below it, might have represented a venial beside a mortal sin. That she was tall and straight in build, that she was ladylike in her movements, was all that could be learnt of her just now, her form being wrapped in a shawl, folded in the old corner-wise fashion, and her head in a large kerchief, a protection not superfluous at this hour and place. Her back was towards the wind, which blew from the northwest, but whether she had avoided that aspect because of the chilly gusts which played about her exceptional position, or because her interest lay in the southeast, did not at first appear. Her reason for standing so dead still at the pivot of this circle of heath country was just as obscure. Her extraordinary fixity, her conspicuous loneliness, her heedlessness of night, betokened, among other things, an utter absence of fear. A tract of country unaltered from that sinister condition which made Caesar anxious every year to get clear of its glooms before the autumnal equinox, a kind of landscape and weather which leads travellers from the south to describe our island as Homer's Cimmerian land, was not, on the face of it, friendly to women. It might reasonably have been supposed that she was listening to the wind, which rose somewhat as the night advanced, and laid hold of the attention. The wind, indeed, seemed made for the scene, as the scene seemed made for the hour. Part of its tone was quite special. What was heard there could be heard nowhere else. Gusts in innumerable series followed each other from the northwest, and when each one of them raced past, the sound of its progress resolved into three. Treble, tenor, and bass notes were to be found therein. The general ricochet of the whole over pits and prominences had the gravest pitch of the chime. Next there could be heard the baritone buzz of a holly-tree. Below these in force, above them in pitch, a dwindled voice strove hard at a husky tune, which was the peculiar local sound alluded to. Thinner and less immediately traceable than the other two, it was far more impressive than either. In it lay what may be called the linguistic peculiarity of the heath, and being audible nowhere on earth off a heath, It afforded the shadow of reason for the woman's tenseness, which continued as unbroken as ever. Throughout the blowing of these plaintive November winds, that note bore a great resemblance to the ruins of human song which remain to the throat of 80. It was a worn whisper, dry and papery, and it brushed so distinctly across the ear that, by the accustomed, the material minutiae in which it originated could be realized as by touch. It was the united products of infinitesimal vegetable causes, and these were neither stems, leaves, fruit, blades, prickles, lichen, nor moss. They were the mummified heath bells of the past summer, originally tender and purple, now washed uncolourless by Michaelmas rains, and dried to dead skins by October suns. So low was an individual sound from these that a combination of hundreds only just emerged from silence, and the myriads of the whole declivity reached the woman's ear but as a shrivelled and intermittent recitative. Yet scarcely a single accent among the many afloat tonight could have such power to impress a listener with thoughts of its origin. One inwardly saw the infinity of these combined multitudes, and perceived that each of the tiny trumpets was seized on, entered, scoured, and emerged from by the wind as thoroughly as if it were as vast as a crater. The spirit moved them. A meaning of the phrase forced itself upon the attention, and an emotional listener's fetichistic mood might have ended in one of more advanced quality. It was not, after all, that the left-hand expanse of old blooms spoke, or the right hand, or those on the slope in front, but it was the single person of something else, speaking through each at once. Suddenly on the barrow there mingled with all this wild rhetoric of night a sound which modulated so naturally into the rest that its beginning and ending were hardly to be distinguished. The bluffs and the bushes and the heather bells had broken the silence. At last so did the woman, and her articulation was but as another phrase of the same discourse as theirs. Thrown out on the winds, it became twined with them, and with them it flew away. What she uttered was a lengthened sighing, apparently at something in her mind which had led to her presence there. There was a spasmodic abandonment about it, as if, in allowing herself to utter the sound, the woman's brain had authorized what it could not regulate. One point was evident in this, that she had been existing in a suppressed state, and not in one of languor nor stagnation. Far away down the valley the faint shine from the window of the inn still lasted on, and a few additional moments proved that the window, or what was within it, had more to do with the woman's sigh than had either her own actions or the scene immediately around. She lifted her left hand, which held a closed telescope. This she rapidly extended, as if she were well accustomed to the operation, and, raising it to her eye, directed it towards the light beaming from the inn. The handkerchief which had hooded her head was now a little thrown back, her face being somewhat elevated. A profile was visible against the dull monochrome of cloud around her, and it was as though side shadows from the features of Sappho and Mrs. Siddons had converged upwards from the tomb to form an image like neither, but suggesting both. This, however, was mere superficiality. In respect of character, a face may make certain admissions by its outline, but it fully confesses only in the changes. So much is this the case, that what is called the play of the features often helps more in understanding a man or woman than the earnest labours of all the other members together. Thus the night revealed little of her whose form it was embracing, for the mobile parts of her countenance could not be seen. At last she gave up her spying attitude, closed the telescope, and turned to the decaying embers. From these no appreciable beams now radiated, except when a more than usually smart gust brushed over their faces, and raised a fitful glow which came and went like the blush of a girl. She stooped over the silent circle, and selecting from the brands a piece of stick which bore the largest live coal at its end, brought it to where she had been standing before. She held the brand to the ground, blowing the red coal with her mouth at the same time, till it faintly illuminated the sod, revealed a small object, which turned out to be an hourglass, though she wore a watch. She blew long enough to show that the sand had all slipped through. "Ah," she said, as if surprised. The light raised by her breath had been very fitful, and a momentary irradiation of flesh was all that it disclosed of her face. That consisted of 2 matchless lips and a cheek only, her head being still enveloped. She threw away the stick, took the glass in her hand, the telescope under her arm, and moved on. Along the ridge ran a faint foot-track, which the lady followed. Those who knew it well called it a path, and, while a mere visitor would have passed it unnoticed even by day, the regular haunters of the heath were at no loss for it at midnight. The whole secret of following these incipient paths, when there was not light enough in the atmosphere to show a turnpike road, lay in the development of the sense of touch in the feet, which comes with years of night rambling in little trodden spots. To a walker practised in such places, a difference between impact on maiden herbage and on the crippled stalks of a slight footway is perceptible through the thickest boot or shoe. The solitary figure who walked this beat took no notice of the windy tunes still played on the dead heath bells. She did not turn her head to look at the group of dark creatures further on, who fled from her presence as she skirted a ravine where they fed. They were about a score of the small wild ponies known as heath-croppers. They roamed at large on the undulations of Egdon, but in numbers too few to detract much from the solitude. The pedestrian noticed nothing just now, and a clue to her abstraction was afforded by a trivial incident. A bramble caught hold of her skirt and checked her progress. Instead of putting it off and hastening along, she yielded herself up to the pull, and stood passively still. When she began to extricate herself, it was by turning round, and so unwinding the prickly switch. She was in a desponding reverie. Her course was in the direction of the small undying fire which had drawn the attention of the men of Rainbarrow and of Wildeave in the valley below. A faint illumination from its rays began to glow upon her face, and the fire soon revealed itself to be lit, not on the level ground, but on a salient corner or redan of earth, at the junction of 2 converging bank fences. Outside was a ditch, dry except immediately under the fire, and there was one large pool, bearded all round by heather and rushes. In the smooth water of the pond, the fire appeared upside down. The banks meeting behind were bare of a hedge, save such as was formed by disconnected tufts of firs, standing upon stems along the top, like impaled heads above a city wall. A white mast, fitted up with spars and other nautical tackle, could be seen rising against the dark clouds whenever the flames played brightly enough to reach it. Altogether the scene had much the appearance of a fortification, upon which had been kindled a beacon fire. Nobody was visible, but ever and anon a whitish something moved above the bank from behind and vanished again. This was a small human hand, in the act of lifting pieces of fuel into the fire, but for all that could be seen, the hand, like that which troubled Belshazzar, was there alone. Occasionally an ember rolled off the bank and dropped with a hiss into the pool. At one side of the pool, rough steps built of clods enabled everyone who wished to do so to mount the bank, which the woman did. Within was a paddock, in an uncultivated state, though bearing evidence of having once been tilled. But the heath and fern had insidiously crept in, and were reasserting their old supremacy. Further ahead were dimly visible an irregular dwelling-house, garden, and outbuildings, backed by a clump of firs. The young lady, for youth had revealed its presence in her buoyant bound up the bank, walked along the top instead of descending inside, and came to the corner where the fire was burning. One reason for the permanence of the blaze was now manifest. The fuel consisted of hard pieces of wood, cleft and sawn, the knotty boles of old thorn trees which grew in twos and threes about the hillsides. A yet unconsumed pile of these lay in the inner angle of the bank, and from this corner the upturned face of a little boy greeted her eyes. He was dilatorily throwing up a piece of wood into the fire every now and again, a business which seemed to have engaged him a considerable part of the evening, for his face was somewhat weary.
"I'm glad you've come, Miss Eustacia," he said, with a sigh of relief. "I don't like biding by myself."
"Nonsense. I have only been a little way for a walk. I have been gone only 20 minutes.
"It seemed long," murmured the boy. "And you have been so many times."
"Why, I thought you would be pleased to have a bonfire. Are you not much obliged to me for making you one?"
"Yes, but there's nobody here to play with me."
"I suppose nobody has come while I was away?"
"Nobody except your grandfather. He looked out of doors once for to see. I told him you were walking round on the hill to look at the other bonfires."
"A good boy."
"I think I hear him coming again, miss."
The old man came into the remoter light of the fire from the direction of the homestead. He was the same who had overtaken the Reddleman on the road that afternoon. He looked wistfully to the top of the bank, at the woman who stood there, and his teeth, which were quite unimpaired, showed like a parian from his parted lips. "When are you coming indoors, Eustacia?" he asked. "'Tis almost bedtime. I've been home these 2 hours, and I'm tired out. Surely 'tis somewhat childish of you to stay out playing at bonfires so long and wasting such fuel. My precious thorn roots, the rarest of all firing, that I laid by on purpose for Christmas. You have burnt 'em nearly all."
"I promised Johnny a bonfire, and it pleases him not to let it go out just yet," said Eustacia, in a way which told at once that she was absolute queen here. "Grandfather, you go in to bed. I shall follow you soon. You like the fire, don't you, Johnny?" The boy looked up doubtfully at her and murmured, "I don't think I want it any longer." Her grandfather had turned back again and did not hear the boy's reply. As soon as the white-haired man had vanished, she said in a tone of pique to the child, "Ungrateful little boy, how can you contradict me? Never shall you have a bonfire again unless you can keep it up now. Come, tell me you'd like to do things for me, and don't deny it." The repressed child said, "Yes, I do, miss," and continued to stir the fire perfunctorily. "Stay a little longer, and I will give you a crooked sixpence," said Eustacia more gently. "Put in one more piece of wood,
every 2 or 3 minutes, but not too much all at once. I am going to walk along the ridge a little longer, but I shall keep on coming to you, and if you hear a frog jump in the pond with a flounce like a stone thrown in, be sure you run and tell me, because it's a sign of rain." "Yes, Eustacia." "Miss Vi, sir." "Miss Vi Stacia?" "That will do. Now, put on 1 stick more." The little slave went on feeding the fire as before. He seemed a mere automaton, galvanized into moving and speaking by the wayward Eustacia's will. He might have been the brass statue which Albertus Magnus is said to have animated, just so far as to make it chatter and move, and be his servant. Before going on her walk again, the young girl stood still on the bank for a few instants and listened. It was to be full as lonely a place as Rainbarrow, though at rather a lower level, and it was more sheltered from wind and weather on account of the few firs to the north. The bank which enclosed the homestead and protected it from the lawless state of the world without was formed of thick square clods, dug from the ditch on the outside, and built up with a slight batter or incline, which forms no slight defence where hedges will not grow because of the wind and the wilderness, and where wall materials are unattainable. Otherwise the situation was quite open, commanding the whole length of the valley, which reached to the river beyond Will Deve's house. High above this, to the right, and much nearer thitherward than the Quiet Woman Inn, the blurred contour of Rainbarrow obstructed the sky. After her attentive survey of the wild slopes and hollow ravines, a gesture of impatience escaped Eustacia. She vented petulant words every now and then, but there were sighs between her words, and sudden listenings between her sighs. Descended from her perch, she again sauntered off toward Rainbarrow, though this time she did not go the whole way. Twice she reappeared at intervals of a few minutes, and each time she said, "Not any flounce into the pond yet, little man?" "No, Miss Eustacia," the child replied. "Well," she said at last, "I shall soon be going in, and then I will give you the crooked sixpence and let you go home." "Thank you, Miss Eustacia," said the tired stoker, breathing more easily, and Eustacia again strolled away from the fire, but this time not towards Rainbarrow. She skirted the bank and went round to the wicket before the house, where she stood motionless, looking at the scene. 50 yards off rose the corner of the 2 converging banks, with the fire upon it. Within the bank, lifting up to the fire 1 stick at a time, just as before, the figure of the little child. She idly watched him as he occasionally climbed up in the nook of the bank and stood beside the brands. The wind blew the smoke and the child's hair and the corner of his pinafore, and all in the same direction. The breeze died, and the pinafore and hair lay still, and the smoke went upright. While Eustacia looked on from this distance, the boy's form visibly started. He slid down the bank and ran across toward the white gate. "Well?" said Eustacia. "A frog have jumped into the pond. Yes, I heard him." "Then it is going to rain, and you'd better go home. You will not be afraid?" She spoke hurriedly, as if her heart had leapt into her throat at the boy's words. "No, because I shall have the crooked sixpence." "Yes, here it is. Now run along as fast as you can. Not that way. Through the garden. There. No other boy in the heath has such a bonfire as yours." The boy, who clearly had had too much of a good thing, marched away into the shadows with alacrity. When he had gone, Eustacia, leaving her telescope and hourglass by the gate, brushed forward from the wicket toward the angle of the bank under the fire. Here, screened by the outwork, she waited. In a few moments a splash was audible from the pond outside. Had the child been there, he would have said a second frog had jumped in, but by most people the sound would have been likened to the fall of a stone into the water. Eustacia stepped upon the bank. "Yes," she said, and held her breath. Thereupon the contour of the man became dimly visible against the low-reaching sky over the valley beyond the outer margin of the pool. He came round it and leapt upon the bank beside her. A low laugh escaped her, the third utterance which the girl had indulged in tonight. The first, when she stood upon the rain-barrow, had expressed anxiety. The second, on the ridge, had expressed impatience. The present one was one of triumphant pleasure. She let her joyous eyes rest upon him without speaking, as upon some wondrous thing she had created out of chaos. "I have come," said the man, who was Wildeave. "You give me no peace. Why do you not leave me alone? I have seen your bonfire all the evening." The words were not without emotion, and retained their level tone as if by a careful equipoise between imminent extremes. At this unexpectedly repressing manner in her lover, the girl seemed to repress herself also. "Of course you have seen my fire," she answered with languid calmness, artificially maintained. "Why shouldn't I have a bonfire on the 5th of November, like other denizens of the heath?" "I knew it was meant for me." "How did you know it? I have had no word with you since you chose her and walked about with her and deserted me entirely, as if I had never been yours life and soul so irretrievably." "Eustacia, could I forget that last autumn by the same day of the month and the same place you lighted exactly such a fire as a signal for me to come, and see you? Why should there have been a bonfire again by Captain Vy's house, if not for the same purpose?" "Yes, yes, I own it," she cried under her breath, with a drowsy fervour of manner and tone which was quite peculiar to her. "Don't begin speaking to me as you did, Damon. You will drive me to say words I would not wish to say to you. I had given you up, and resolved not to think of you any more. And then I heard the news, and I came out and got the fire ready because I thought that you had been faithful to me." "What have you heard to make you think that?" said Wildeave, astonished. "That you did not marry her," she murmured exultingly. "And I knew it was because you loved me best, and couldn't do it. Damon, you have been cruel to me to go away, and I have said I would never forgive you. I do not think I can forgive you entirely, even now. It is too much for a woman of any spirit to quite overlook." "If I had known you wished to call me up here only to reproach me, I wouldn't have come." "But I don't mind it, and I do forgive you now that you have not married her, and have come back to me." "Who told you that I had not married her?" "My grandfather. He took a long walk today, and as he was coming home he overtook some person who told him of a broken-off wedding. He thought it might be yours, and I knew it was." "Does anybody else know?" "I suppose not. Now, Damon, do you see why I built the signal fire? You did not think I would have lit it if I had imagined you to have become the husband of this woman. It is insulting my pride to suppose that." Wildeave was silent. It was evident that he had supposed as much.
"Did you indeed think I believed you were married?" she again demanded earnestly. "Then you wronged me, and upon my life and heart I can hardly bear to recognize that you have such ill thoughts of me. Damon, you are not worthy of me. I see it, and yet I love you. Never mind, let it go. I must bear your mean opinion as best I may. It is true, is it not?" she added with ill-concealed anxiety on his making demonstration, "that you could not bring yourself to give me up, and are still going to love me best of all?"
"Yes, or why should I have come?" he said touchily. "Not that fidelity will be any great merit in me after your kind speech about my unworthiness, which should have been said by myself, if by anybody, and comes with an ill grace from you. However, the curse of inflammability is upon me, and I must live under it, and take my snub from a woman. It has brought me down from engineering to innkeeping. What lower stage has it in store for me I have yet to learn." He continued to look upon her gloomily. She seized the moment, and, throwing back the shawl so that the firelight shone full upon her face and throat, said with a smile, "Have you seen anything better than that in your travels?" Eustacia was not one to commit herself to such a position without good ground, so he said quietly, "No." "Not even on the shoulders of Thomason?" "Thomason is a pleasing and innocent woman."
"That has nothing to do with it," she cried with quick passionateness. "We will leave her out. There are only you and me now to think of." After a long look at him, she resumed with the old quiescent warmth. "Must I go on weakly confessing to you things a woman ought to conceal, and own that no words can express how gloomy I have been because of that dreadful belief I held till 2 hours ago that you had quite deserted me?"
"I am sorry that I caused you that pain."
"But perhaps it is not wholly because of you that I get gloomy," she archly added. "It is in my nature to feel like that. I was born in my blood, I suppose.
Hypochondriasis.
Or else it was coming into this wild heath. I was happy enough at Budmouth. Oh, the times, oh, the days at Budmouth! But Egdon will be brighter again now."
"I hope it will," said Will Deave moodily. "Do you know the consequence of this recall to me, me old darlin'? I shall come to see ye again, as before, at Rainbarrow."
"Of course you will."
"And yet I declare that until I got here tonight I intended, after this one good-bye, never to meet you again."
"I don't thank you for that," she said, turning away, while indignation spread through her like subterranean heat. "You may come again to Rainbarrow if you like, but you won't see me, and you may call, but I shall not listen, and you may tempt me, but I won't give myself to you any more."
"You have said as much before, sweet, but such natures as yours don't so easily adhere to their words. Neither, for the matter of that, do such natures as mine."
"This is the pleasure I have won for my trouble," she whimpered bitterly. "Why did I try to recall you, Damon? A strange warring takes place in my mind occasionally. I think, when I become calm after your woundings, do I embrace a cloud or a common fog? After all, you are a chameleon. And now you are at your worst colour. Go home, or I shall hate you."
He looked absently towards Rainbarrow, whilst one might have counted 20, and said, as if he did not mind all this, "Yes, I will go home. Do you mean to see me again?"
"If you own to me that the wedding is broken off because you love me best."
"I don't think that would be a good policy," said Will Deave, smiling. you would get to know the extent of your power too clearly.
But tell me.
You know.
Where is she now?
I don't know. I prefer not to speak of her to you. I have not yet married her. I have come in obedience to your call. That is enough.
I merely lit that fire because I was dull, and thought I would get a little excitement by calling you up and triumphing over you, as the witch of Endor called up Samuel. I determined you would come, and you have come. I have shown my power. 1.5 miles further, and 1.5 miles back again to your home, 3 miles in the dark for me. Have I not shown my power?"
He shook his head at her. "I know you too well, my Eustacia. I know you too well. There isn't one note in you which I don't know, and that hot little bosom couldn't play such a cold-blooded trick to save its life. I saw a woman on Rainbarrow at dusk looking down toward my house. I think I drew out you before you drew out me." The revived embers of an old passion glowed clearly in Wildeave now, and he leant forward, as if about to put his face toward her cheek. "Oh, no," she said, intractably moving to the other side of the decayed fire. "What did you mean by that?" "Perhaps I might kiss your hand?" "No, you may not." "Then I may shake your hand?" "No." "Then I will wish you good night, without caring for either. Good-bye. Good-bye." She returned no answer, and with the bow of a dancing-master he vanished on the other side of the pool as he had come. Eustacia sighed. It was no fragile maiden sigh, but a sigh which shook her like a shiver. Whenever a flash of reason darted like an electric light upon her lover, as it sometimes would, and showed his imperfections, she shivered thus. But it was over in a second, and she loved on. She knew that he trifled with her, but she loved on. She scattered the half-burnt brands, went indoors immediately, and up to her bedroom without a light. Amid the rustles which denoted her to be undressing in the darkness, other heavy breaths frequently came, and the same kind of shudder occasionally moved through her when, 10 minutes later, she lay on her bed, asleep. So ends Chapter 6, The Figure Against the Sky.
Book 1, The Three Women. 7. Queen of Night. Eustacia Vi was the raw material of a divinity. On Olympus she would have done well with a little preparation. She had the passions and instincts which make a model goddess, that is, those which make not quite a model woman. Had it been possible for the earth and mankind to be entirely in her grasp for a while, she had handled the distaff, the spindle, and the shears at her own free will. Few in the world would have noticed the change of government. There would have been the same inequality of lot, the same heaping up of favours here, of contumely there, the same generosity before justice, the same perpetual dilemmas, the same capacious alteration of caresses and blows that we endure now. She was in person full-limbed and somewhat heavy, without ruddiness as without pallor, and soft to the touch as a cloud. To see her hair was to fancy that a whole winter did not contain darkness enough to form its shadow. It closed over her forehead like nightfall, extinguishing the western glow. Her nerves extended into these tresses, and her temper could always be softened by stroking them down. When her hair was brushed, she would instantly sink into stillness and look like the Sphinx. If, in passing under one of the Egdon banks, any of its thick skeins were caught, as they sometimes were, by a prickly tuft of the large Ulex europaeus, which will act as a sort of hairbrush, she would go back a few steps, and pass against it a second time. She had pagan eyes, full of nocturnal mysteries, and their light, as it came and went and came again, was partially hampered by their oppressive lids and lashes, and of these the underlid was much fuller than it usually is with English women. This enabled her to indulge in reverie without seeming to do so. She might have been believed capable of sleeping without closing them up. Assuming that the souls of men and women were visible essences, you could fancy the color of Eustatia's soul to be flame-like. The sparks from it that rose into her dark pupils gave the same impression. The mouth seemed formed less to speak than to quiver, less to quiver than to kiss. Some might have added, less to kiss than to curl. Viewed sideways, the closing line of her lips formed, with almost geometric precision, the curve so well known to the arts of design as the cima recta, or ogee. The sight of such a flexible bend as that on grim Egdon was quite an apparition. It was felt at once that the mouth did not come over from Sleswig with a band of Saxon pirates whose lips met like the two halves of a muffin. One had fancied that such lip curves were mostly lurking underground in the south as fragments of forgotten marbles. So fine were the lines of her lips that, though full, each corner of her mouth was as clearly cut as the point of a spear. This keenness of corner was only blunted when she was given over to sudden fits of gloom, one of the phases of the night side of sentiment, which she knew too well for her years. Her presence brought memories of such things as Bourbon roses, rubies, and tropical midnight. Her moods recalled lotus-eaters and the march in Athalie. Her motions, the ebb and flow of the sea, her voice, the viola. In a dim light, and with a slight rearrangement of her hair, her general figure might have stood for that of either of the higher female deities. The new moon behind her head, an old helmet upon it, a diadem of accidental dewdrops round her brow, would have been adjuncts sufficient to strike the note of Artemis, Athena, or Hera, respectively, with as close an approximation to the antique as that which passes muster on many respected canvases. But celestial imperiousness, love, wrath, and fervour had proved to be somewhat thrown away on netherward Egdon. Her power was limited, and the consciousness of this limitation had biased her development. Egdon was her Hades, and since coming there she had imbibed much of what was dark in its tone, though inwardly and externally unreconciled thereto. Her appearance accorded well with this smouldering rebelliousness, and the shady splendor of her beauty was the real surface of the sad and stifled warmth within her. A true Tartarian dignity sat upon her brow, and not factitiously or with marks of constraint, for it had grown in her with years. Across the upper part of her head she wore a thin fillet of black velvet, restraining the luxuriance of her shady hair, in a way which added much to this class of majesty by irregularly clouding her forehead. Nothing can embellish a beautiful face more than a narrow band drawn over the brow, says Richter. Some of the neighboring girls wore colored ribbons for the same purpose, and sporting metallic ornaments elsewhere. But if anyone suggested colored ribbon and metallic ornaments to Eustacia Vi, she laughed and went on. Why did a woman of this sort live on Egdon Heath? Budmouth was her native place, a fashionable seaside resort at that date. She was the daughter of the bandmaster of a regiment which had been quartered there, a Coryphaeot by birth, and a fine musician, who met his future wife during her trip thither with her father and captain, a man of good family. The marriage was scarcely in accord with the old man's wishes, for the bandmaster's pockets were as light as his occupation. But the musician did his best, adopted his wife's name, made England permanently his home, took great trouble with his child's education, the expenses of which were defrayed by the grandfather, and throve as the chief local musician till her mother's death, when he left off thriving, drank, and died also. The girl was left to the care of her grandfather, who, since 3 of his ribs became broken in a shipwreck, had lived in this airy perch on Egdon, a spot which had taken his fancy because the house was to be had for next to nothing, and because a remote blue tinge on the horizon between the hills, visible from the cottage door, was traditionally believed to be the English Channel. She hated the change. She felt like one banished, but here she was forced to abide. Thus it happened that in Eustatia's brain were juxtaposed the strangest assortment of ideas, from old time and from new. There was no middle distance in her perspective. Romantic recollections of sunny afternoons on an esplanade, with military bands, officers, and gallants around, stood like gilded letters upon the dark tablet of surrounding Egdon. Every bizarre effect that could result from the random intertwining of watering place glitter with the grand solemnity of a heath was to be found in her. Seeing nothing of human life now, she imagined all the more of what she had seen. Where did her dignity come from? By a latent vein from Alcinous' line, her father hailing from Phaeacia's isle, or from Fitzalan and De Vere, her maternal grandfather having a cousin in the peerage? Perhaps it was the gift of heaven, a happy convergence of natural laws. Among other things, opportunity had of late years been denied her of learning to be undignified, for she lived lonely. Isolation on a heath renders vulgarity well-nigh impossible. It would have been as easy as the heath ponies, bats, and snakes to be vulgar as for her. A narrow life in Budmouth might have completely demeaned her. The only way to look queenly, without realms or hearts to queen it over, is to look as if you had lost them, and Eustacia did that to a triumph. In the captain's cottage she could suggest mansions she had never seen. Perhaps that was because she frequented a vaster mansion than any of them, the open hills. Like the summer condition of the place around her, she was an embodiment of the phrase, a populous solitude. Apparently so listless, void, and quiet, she was really busy and full. To be loved to madness, such was her great desire. Love was to her the one cordial which could drive away the eating loneliness of her days, and she seemed to long for the abstraction called passionate love more than for any particular lover. She could show a most reproachful look at times, but it was directed less against human beings than against certain creatures of her mind, the chief of these being Destiny, through whose interference she dimly fancied it arose that love alighted only on gliding youth, that any love she might win would sink simultaneously with the sand in the glass. She thought of it with an ever-growing consciousness of cruelty, which tended to breed actions of reckless unconventionality, framed to snatch a year's, a week's, even an hour's passion from anywhere while it could be won. Through want of it, she had sung without being merry, possessed without enjoying, outshone without triumphing. Her loneliness deepened her desire. On Egdon, coldest and meanest kisses were at famine prices, and where was a mouth matching hers to be found? Fidelity in love, for fidelity's sake, had less attraction for her than for most women. Fidelity, because of love's grip, had much. A blaze of love and extinction was better than a lantern glimmer of the same, which should last long years. On this head she knew by prevision what most women learn only by experience. She had mentally walked round love, told the towers thereof, considered its palaces, and concluded that love was but a doleful joy. Yet she desired it, as one in a desert would be thankful for brackish water. She often repeated her prayers, not at particular times, but like the unaffectedly devout, when she desired to pray. Her prayer was always spontaneous, and often ran thus: "O deliver my heart from this fearful gloom and loneliness. Send me great love from somewhere, else I shall die." Her high gods were William the Conqueror, Strafford, and Napoleon Bonaparte, as they had appeared in the lady's history used at the establishment in which she was educated. Had she been a mother, she would have christened her boys such names as Saul or Sisera, in preference to Jacob or David, neither of whom she admired. At school she had used to side with the Philistines in several battles, and had wondered if Pontius Pilate were as handsome as he was frank and fair. Thus she was a girl of some forwardness of mind, indeed, weighed in relation to her situation among the very rearward of thinkers, very original. Her instincts toward social nonconformity were at the root of this. In the matter of holidays, her mood was that of horses who, when turned out to grass, enjoy looking upon their kind at work on the highway. She only valued rest to herself when it came in the midst of other people's labor. Hence she hated Sundays when all was at rest, and often said they would be the death of her. To see the heathmen in their Sunday condition, that is, with their hands in their pockets, their boots newly oiled, and not laced up, a particularly Sunday sign, walking leisurely among the turves and furze faggots they had cut during the week, and kicking them critically as if their use were unknown, was a fearful heaviness to her. To relieve the tedium of this untimely day, she would overhaul the cupboards containing her grandfather's old charts and other rubbish, humming Saturday night ballads of the country people the while. But on Saturday nights she would frequently sing a psalm, and it was always on a weekday that she read the Bible, that she might be unoppressed with a sense of doing her duty. Such views of life were to some extent the natural begettings of her situation upon her nature. To dwell on a heath without studying its meanings was like wedding a foreigner without learning his tongue. The subtle beauties of the heath were lost to Eustacia. She only caught its vapors. An environment which would have made a contented woman a poet, a suffering woman a devotee, a pious woman a psalmist, even a giddy woman thoughtful, made a rebellious woman saturnine. Eustacia had got beyond the vision of some marriage of inexpressible glory. Yet, though her emotions were in full vigor, she cared for no meaner union. Thus we see her in a strange state of isolation, to have lost the godlike conceit that we may do what we will, and not to have acquired a homely zest for doing what we can, shows a grandeur of temper which cannot be objected to in the abstract, for it denotes a mind that, though disappointed, forswears compromise. But if congenial to philosophy, it is apt to be dangerous to the commonwealth. In a world where doing means marrying, and the commonwealth is one of hearts and hands, the same peril attends the condition. And so we see our Eustacia, for at times she was not altogether unlovable, arriving at that stage of enlightenment which feels that nothing is worth while, and filling up the spare hours of her existence by idealizing Wildev for want of a better object. This was the sole reason of his ascendancy. She knew it herself. At moments her pride rebelled against her passion for him, and she even had longed to be free. But there was only one circumstance which could dislodge him, and that was the advent of a greater man. For the rest, she suffered much from depression of spirits, and took slow walks to recover them, in which she carried her grandfather's telescope and her grandmother's hourglass, the latter because of a peculiar pleasure she derived from watching a material representation of time's gradual glide away. She seldom schemed, but when she did scheme, her plans showed rather the comprehensive strategy of a general than the small arts called womanish. Though she could utter oracles of Delphian ambiguity when she did not choose to be direct. In heaven she will probably sit between the Heloises and the Cleopatras. End of 7. Queen of Night.
Chapter 8. Those who are found where there is said to be nobody. As soon as the sad little boy had withdrawn from the fire, he clasped the money tight in the palm of his hand, as if thereby to fortify his courage, and began to run. There was really little danger in allowing a child to go home on this part of Egdon Heath. The distance to the boy's house was not more than 3/8 of a mile, his father's cottage, and one other a few yards farther on, forming part of the small hamlet of Mistover Knapp. The third and only remaining house was that of Captain Vi and Eustacia, which stood quite away from the small cottages, and was the loneliest of the lonely houses on these thinly populated slopes. He ran until he was out of breath, and then, becoming more courageous, walked leisurely along, singing in an old voice a little song about a sailor boy and a fair one, and bright gold in store. In the middle of this the child stopped. From a pit under the hill ahead of him shone a light, whence proceeded a cloud of floating dust and a smacking noise. Only unusual sights and sounds frightened the boy. The shriveled voice of the heath did not alarm him, for that was familiar. The thorn bushes which arose in his path from time to time were less satisfactory, for they whistled gloomily, and had a ghastly habit after dark of putting on the shapes of jumping madmen, sprawling giants, and hideous cripples. Lights were not uncommon this evening, but the nature of all of them was different from this. Discretion rather than terror prompted the boy to turn back instead of passing the light, with a view of asking Miss Eustacia Vi to let her servant accompany him home. When the boy had reascended to the top of the valley, he found the fire to be still burning on the bank, though lower than before. Beside it, instead of Eustacia's solitary form, he saw 2 persons, the second being a man. The boy crept along the bank to ascertain from the nature of the proceedings if it would be prudent to interrupt so splendid a creature as Miss Eustacia on his poor trivial account. After listening under the bank for some minutes to the talk, he turned in a perplexed and doubting manner, and began to withdraw as silently as he had come. That he did not, upon the whole, think it advisable to interrupt her conversation with Willdeve, without being prepared to bear the whole weight of her displeasure, was obvious. Here was a Scileo-Charybdian position for the poor boy. Pausing, when again safe from discovery, he finally decided to face the pit phenomenon as the lesser evil. With a heavy sigh, he retraced the slope, and followed the path he had followed before. The light had gone, the rising dust had disappeared. He hoped forever. He marched resolutely along, and found nothing to alarm him, till, coming within a few yards of the sand-pit, he heard a slight noise in front which led him to halt. The halt was but momentary, for the noise resolved itself into the steady bites of 2 animals grazing. "2 heath croppers down here," he said aloud. "I never known 'em to come down so far afore." The animals were in the direct line of his path, but that the child thought little of. He had played round the fetlocks of the horses from his infancy. On coming nearer, however, the boy was somewhat surprised to find the creatures did not run off, and that each wore a clog to prevent his going astray. This signified that they had been broken in. He could see now the interior of the pit, which, being in the side of the hill, had a level entrance. In the innermost corner the square outline of a van appeared, with its back towards him. A light came from the interior, and threw a moving shadow upon the vertical face of gravel at the further side of the pit, into which the vehicle faced. The child assumed that this was the cart of a gypsy, and his dread of those wanderers reached but to that mild pitch which titillates rather than pains. Only a few inches of mud wall kept him and his family from being gypsies themselves. He skirted the gravel pit at a respectful distance, ascended the slope, and came forward upon the brow in order to look upon the open door of the van and see the original of the shadow. The picture alarmed the boy. By a little stove inside the van sat a figure red from head to heels, the man who had been Thomason's friend. He was darning a stocking, which was red like the rest of him. Moreover, as he darned, he smoked a pipe, the stem and bowl of which were red also. At this moment one of the heath-croppers, feeding in the outer shadows, was audibly shaking off the clog attached to its foot. Aroused by the sound, the Reddleman laid down his stocking, lit a lantern which hung beside him, and came out from the van. In sticking up the candle, he lifted the lantern to his face, and the light shone into the whites of his eyes and upon his ivory teeth, which, in contrast with the red surrounding, led him a startling enough aspect to the gaze of a juvenile. The boy knew too well for his peace of mind upon whose lair he had lighted. Uglier persons than gipsies were known to cross Egdon at times, and a Reddleman was one of them. "How I wish 'twas only a gipsy," he murmured. The man was by this time coming back from the horses. In his fear of being seen, the boy rendered detection certain by nervous motion. The heather and peat stratum overhung the bow of the pit in mats, hiding the actual verge. The boy had stepped beyond the solid ground. The heather now gave way, and down he rolled over the scarp of grey sand to the very foot of the man. The red man opened the lantern and turned it upon the figure of the prostrate boy. "Who be ye?" he said.
"Johnny Nonsuch, master."
"What were you doing up there?"
"I don't know."
"Watching me, I suppose."
"Yes, master."
"What did you watch me for?"
"Because I was coming home from Miss Vi's bonfire."
"Be'st hurt?"
"No."
"Why, yes, you be. Your hand is bleeding. Come up under me tilt and let me tie it up."
"Please let me look for my sixpence."
"How'd you come by that?"
"Miss Vi guided to me for keeping up a bonfire."
The sixpence was found, and the man went to the van, the boy behind, almost holding his breath. The man took a piece of rag from a satchel containing sewing materials, tore off a strip, which, like everything else, was tinged red, and proceeded to bind up the wound.
"My eyes have got foggy like. Please, may I sit down, master?" said the boy.
"To be sure, chap. 'Tis enough to make you feel fainty. Sit down on that bundle." The man finished tying up the gash, and the boy said,
"I think I'll go home now, master."
"You are rather afraid of me. Do you know what I be?" The child surveyed his vermilion figure up and down with much misgiving, and finally said,
"Yes."
"Well, what?"
"The Reddleman," he faltered.
"Yes, that's what I be, though there is more than one. You little children think there's only one cuckoo, one fox, one giant, one devil, and one Reddleman, though there's lots of us all."
"Is there? You won't carry me off in your bags, will you, master? 'Tis said that the Reddleman will sometimes."
"Nonsense! All the Reddlemen do is sell riddle. You see all those bags in the back of my cart? They're not full of little boys, only full of red stuff."
"Was you born a Reddleman?"
"No, I took to it. I should be as white as you if I were to give up the trade. That is, I should be white in time, perhaps 6 months. Not at first, because 'tis growed into me skin and won't wash out. Now, you'll never be afraid of a Reddleman again, will ye?"
"No, never. Willie Orchard said he seed a red ghost here the other day. Perhaps that was you?"
"I was here the other day."
"Were you making that dusty light I saw by now?"
"Oh, yes, I was beating out some bags. And have you had a good bonfire up there? I saw the light. Why did Miss Vi want a bonfire so bad that she should give you 6pence to keep it up?"
"I don't know. I was tired, but she made me bide and keep up the fire just the same, while she was going up across Rainbarrow way."
"And how long did that last?"
"Until a hop frog jumped into the pond."
The Reddleman suddenly ceased to talk idly. "A hop frog?" he inquired. "Hop frogs don't jump into ponds this time of year."
"They do, for I heard one."
"Certain sure?"
"Yes. She told me afore that I should hear 'un, and so I did. They say she's clever and deep, and perhaps she charmed 'em to come."
"And what then?"
"Then I came down here, and I was afeard, and I went back, but I didn't like to speak to her because of the gentleman, and I came on here again."
"A gentleman? Ah! What did she say to him, my man?"
"Told him that she supposed he had not married the other woman because he liked his old sweetheart best, and things like that."
"What did the gentleman say to her, my sonny?"
"He only said that he did like her best, and how he was coming out to see her again under rainbow nights."
"Ha!" cried the Reddleman, slapping his thigh against the side of the van, so that the whole fabric shook under the blow. "That's the secret of it." The little boy jumped clean from the stool. "My man, don't you be afraid," said the dealer in red, suddenly becoming gentle. "I forgot you were there. That's only a curious way Reddlemen have of going mad for a moment, but they don't hurt anybody. And what did the lady say then?"
"I can't mind. Please, Master Reddleman, may I go home alone now?"
"Aye, to be sure you may. I'll go a bit of the ways with you." He conducted the boy out of the gravel pit into the path leading to his mother's cottage. When the little figure had vanished in the darkness, the Reddleman returned, resumed his seat by the fire, and proceeded to darn again. So ends Chapter 8. Those who are found where there is said to be nobody.